The English found what they could not accomplish with the torch and the gun, they could accomplish with the stroke of the pen. So that's why they mislabeled our people racially in the records more and more as time went on, until eventually there was no Indian presence in the records. There was never that designation. You were identified as mulatto, musty, or any of those other terms rather than Indian.
Such was the effort to erase Indians from history that up until the early 20th century, scientists of academic institutions deliberately altered census records.
In Virginia, there was a leader of the eugenics movement, a man by the name of Dr. Walter Plecker. He changed records of Virginia Indians that were born and recorded as Indian people to say that they were colored. He did this on birth certificates, marriage certificates, on death certificates, on any legal records that he could get his hands on. So since he physically destroyed or changed records of so many Virginia Indians, he essentially committed an act of bureaucratic genocide on the Virginia Indians. I can't see a more obvious event than what happened in the 20th century in terms of Virginia Indians being written out of history.
Sometimes it got to the point where you were even afraid to say that you were Indian. And you told your children not to because it was safer. And so there were just all these different ways of erasing Native people as well as African American people from the cultural landscapes.
At one point in time, it was a bad thing to even say you were Native American. Some people had to lie on their birth certificates and state that they were either black or that they were white. So that definitely had an effect on Native American people.
Native people have become the invisible minority here, particularly in the Northeast. The census takers, who were generally white males, made their decision about who was Indian and who was not Indian. And if you did not look Indian...
So profitable that Carolina's English and Scottish slavers and their Indian allies pushed themselves deep into Spanish and French territories to hunt for captives. The trade in Indian slaves was a vast enterprise that stretched from as far west as Spanish New Mexico to as far north as the Great Lakes. Virtually every tribe living in this large area was involved in this commerce either as a supplier of captives or as middlemen.
The Caddo traded Licon Apache, but the Caddo don't really seem to keep slaves. They just kind of trade. It's down the line trade, so to speak. After that, where you have the first count of slaves is more people like from lower Louisiana, the Washoe, the Chawasha, the Chitimacha, people like that go into Mobile. By the time they're settled up here and the system is well entrenched in the French trading system, the primary source of slaves was coming from the West.
Many indigenous nations suffered due to enslavement. On the Atlantic seaboard, entire tribes were sold into slavery to the Caribbean.
A compelling example of Indians being sold into slavery in Virginia that's often overlooked is what happened to the Nansadeco people in 1704. That's actually the one instance that we have where a tribe was essentially eliminated as a result of a conflict here. And a small party of those Nansadeco Indians committed a killing of one family, the John Rowley family. But what happened as a result, the Nansadeco were impugned to give up the killers, and they did that. And the killers were convicted in English court, and they were hanged. But the General Assembly also decided that the entire nation could be retaliated against because of what these men had done. So they actually passed a ruling that enslaved the entire population of the Nanzatico, with the exception of children that were under 12, and all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua, in the West Indies.
Other than being a convenient source of free labor, the enslavement and deportation of Indians to the Caribbean was part of a systematic plan to eliminate the native presence from the emerging colonies.
Because at that time, they did not talk about being Indians because you could be jailed, correct?
Exactly. There was a lot of bad things that could have happened to you if you were native and if you were caught off the reservation. In some cases, you could be shot on sight. Okay? But getting back to William Lamb, who Paramore and Floyd Painter, Paramore wrote the history of Southampton County, said was the last Chernock-Anotaway riding a bicycle in court. And again, we know that was not true because William Lamb Howell, who was my war chief, is his grandson. But that's typical of what happened to first Americans in the Commonwealth. How things were done to actually change, not only to change one's race, but to change one's ethnicity, to take away their traditions, to take away their cultures, etc. And I'd like to go back to the 1808 Chernock-Anotaway Indian census to my fifth foster great-grandmother, who was Queen Edith Turner. Her name was really Wane Runsira, but the whites called her Turner. And the names, the colonial names, were given to us the same basically as the slave mentality.
The slaves were, yeah.
If your mother was a slave and living on a reservation, that means your child was a slave and that you took on the name of the master. So what had happened with native people, we didn't have colonial names. We had native names. My fourth great-grandmother's name was Carahoot. That was her native name. But when they did the census, they pinned her as being Mary Polly Whitson, who married Pearson's Turner and became Mary Turner and went over to Artistown in 1825 along with the Bozeman, the Browns, the Artists, the Boones, and the Whitsons.
War with the Pequot tribe. The turning point was when over 300 men, women, and children were burned alive in the fort at Mystic, Connecticut. The native people that had not been slaughtered were put into slavery, and either in the other tribes who assisted the English in that war, or they were enslaved by the English themselves and sold out of the country in fairly large numbers. And they were sent to various places, and one of the favorite destinations was Bermuda.
Indian slaves were shipped from ports such as Mobile and New Orleans. Whilst the English sent them to Barbados, the French sent them to Martinique and Guadeloupe, and the Dutch sent them to their domains in the Antilles.
We understand the Middle Passage in the sense of Africans coming to the Americas, but few of us understand that there was also a Middle Passage from the Americas to the Bahamas, which were the breaking grounds for the slaves, but also to New England, where the markets were. There were some that were sent back to Europe. The very first ones that were sent back to Europe were the property of the king, the queen, and the church. And so, interestingly enough, many of the first Indian slaves were taken back to become, wards of the state and the property of the people there.
Between 1650 and the beginnings of the 18th century, as many as 50,000 Indian slaves had been sold by the English alone to their colonial.
The year 1636 was part of that war with the Pequot tribe. The turning point was when over 300 men, women, and children were burned alive in the fort at Mystic, Connecticut. The native people that had not been slaughtered were put into slavery, and either in the other tribes who assisted the English in that war, or they were enslaved by the English themselves and sold out of the country in fairly large numbers. And they were sent to various places, and one of the favorite destinations was Bermuda.
Indian slaves were shipped from ports such as Mobile and New Orleans. Whilst the English sent them to Barbados, the French sent them to Martinique and Guadeloupe, and the Dutch sent them to their domains in the Antilles.
We understand the Middle Passage in the sense of Africans coming to the Americas, but few of us understand that there was also a Middle Passage from the Americas to the Bahamas, which were the breaking grounds for the slaves, but also to New England, where the markets were. There were some that were sent back to Europe. The very first ones that were sent back to Europe were the property of the king, the queen, and the church. And so, interestingly enough, many of the first Indian slaves were taken back to become, you know, wards of the state and the property of the people there.
Between 1650 and the beginnings of the 18th century, as many as 50,000 Indian slaves had been sold by the English alone to their colonial outposts in the Caribbean. But these numbers are incomplete because many transactions were unrecorded.
If you want to understand the beginnings of Native American slavery, you have to understand the juxtaposition of the three European colonizing strategies in North America. And they were the fur trade in the Northeast, the plantation system in the South, and the Spanish mission system in Florida. One of the most poignant examples of the disruption of Indian slavery on native groups can be seen through the Appalachian Indians. When the English colony of Carolina developed in 1670, very shortly afterwards, the Appalachee became a primary target for Indian slave raids from Carolina. By 1704, the mission was devastated by these slave raids, and many Appalachee were killed. A vast majority of the remaining Appalachee were sold into slavery in Cuba. Were sold into slavery in Cuba. Were sold into slavery in Cuba.
No sign remained of the Appalachies' flourishing culture after the incursions of the English and Indian slave traders. Their temples were burned down, their magnificent council houses were destroyed, and their fields were abandoned. What was once a powerful nation of more than 6,000 people was reduced to a handful of scattered survivors.
If you look at the old censuses, you will see people who clearly we know are of Native American ancestry categorized as colored people or mulattoes. So there are many African Americans today, people socially identified as African Americans, who have Indian ancestry, and I think that's why you see now at the beginning of the 21st century, you see them trying to reclaim their Indian heritage. I think for the first time, they're now being given the opportunity to do so.
I'm William Attlee, and this is a news brief with truth. See the men on the screen. They are the ancestors of the African American, but there is a problem: their true identity. Thomas McNeely has the story.
Well, William, the African American community is deeply divided due to the tagline, African Americans ain't Africans, which can be found in numerous places on the web. Now, it should be obvious as to why it's causing a commotion, but if it escapes you, let me explain. The current American education states African Americans were brought to America as slaves from Africa, which is simply not true. They are American indigenous, not descendants of Africans. As they say, the truth is stranger than fiction. Although this fact isn't spoken of openly, it's not a secret. However, with programming such as Roots, 12 Years a Slave, The African American Story, and The Book of Negroes, is it any wonder why so many African Americans are confused? We won't address all the misleading DNA tests being provided to connect African Americans to Africa. So, the argument is, do they continue identifying as African Americans, which is a fake identity for them, or embrace being identified as indigenous Americans?
Are there any consequences of choosing one identity over the other?
William, that's a good question. According to African Americans Ain't Africans Facebook forum, identifying as African American is to quietly relinquish ancestral connections to America, connections that go back hundreds of thousands of years. A curious story, but one appropriate for February, which is Black History Month in the United States.
What's a conundrum? a story worth keeping an eye on for further developments. Thank you, Thomas. The drawing used in this presentation is from the 16th century book, America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World by John Ogilby and Arnoldus Montanus. As you may have guessed, the men in the drawing are American. I'm William Attlee, and this has been a news brief with truth.
The term African American to refer to all black people was endorsed only since 1989, but was against the desires of the majority of black people. In fact, the term was endorsed by only 5 people, including Reverend Jesse Jackson and Ramona Edlin leading the charge, as a result of a gathering called the African American Summit, without the input of the majority of black people. Author Avis J. Smith went to the district court in Washington, D.C. to stand against this term, as well as against the notion that a small group of powerful individuals should be able to compel the masses into adopting it. African American, the opposition court case, asks the question, who sanctions language? Who creates and enforces the wording that we use day in and day out? And do these people actually have the authority to do so?
Convince the Virginia legislature to adopt very restrictive legislation in 1924. It's called the Racial Integrity Act. With this legislation, it was decreed that there were only 2 possible categories. One is white, which means a person, you check that you're white if you have white ancestry, Caucasian ancestry, and absolutely nothing else. The other category is everybody else, and that's colored. So this was very hard on Virginia's indigenous community because, in a sense, it wipes away their identity on paper. Their ability to describe themselves as Indian was not possible in the state of Virginia until 1968, when the U.S. Supreme Court forced Virginia to repeal the law.
The history of the Pokanoket tribe actually was the headship tribe of what you call the Wampanoag Nation today. But when the English came to this country, this whole area was known as Pokanoket country, or King Philip country later on. Any map prior to the King Philip War will stay right on it, Pokanoket country. So Wampanoag is a name that was given to us during the King Philip War, around the year 1675, 1676, when the colonists outlawed the word Pokanoket and made it illegal for you, if you were male 14 years of age or older, to say you were Pokanoket. And they started calling us Wampanoag at that time. And that was a law that was on the books until after the year 2000. And if you were 14 years of age or older and you were male, they would kill you on sight if you.
At that time, there was a lot of people that was using what we call pencil genocide. In other words, they were changing documents in the town halls and this and that, and unless you had some question about it, you didn't even know it. So, for example, in my dad's family, my Aunt Marion, my Aunt Josephine, and my Uncle Lewis were down as Indian. Uncle Lawrence and my father were down as black. My mother's birth certificate, she was born in on Cogswell Street, which is Pawcatuck, Connecticut. And the doctor, knowing that she wasn't black, naturally, because he was very well familiar with the Babcock family, put her down as white. And a lot of us were put down as white just so we would not have that stigma of being black.
To pre-Jacksonian America, and the time of Indian removal, there's no advantage to identifying as Indian, unless it was very important for you to keep your family and kin and nation together. If you were most interested in remaining where you were, because that was sacred ground where you were living, because you did not want to be removed, then there's advantage of identifying as African, which means then you would not be rounded up, put on the rolls, and sent west, but you could stay right where you were. Of course, there is a disadvantage at this time of identifying as African, because you run the risk then of being enslaved. But at least you wouldn't be removed necessarily.
Around the turn of the century, the Cherokee were once again part of a government operation known as the Dawes Commission. And at that time, the land which we held in common at one time for time immemorial became individual allotments to Cherokee citizens.
Indeed, the whole construction of the Dawes Roll, by which Indian nations were allotted, is based on the assumption that blood quantum, that is the degree of any particular ancestry, white, Indian, black, the degree to which you are one of those determines certain cultural characteristics. That is, how able you are to manage your allotment.
It was at that time that the separation as citizens between black freedmen and Cherokee by blood was made. The Cherokee freedmen, if they were not also Cherokee by blood, were not given an allotment and thus were not part of the Dawes enrollment process.
A lot of knowledge that's been erased. The fact that freedman was never in my vocabulary. I never heard that in terms of a designation of my family history. My father always talked about being of part Choctaw ancestry, but his father, who died in 1940, my grandfather, was on the roll as a Choctaw freedman. The last person in our family who died, who was on the Dawes rolls, just died this year. She was 94. She was a Choctaw freedman newborn. And when I spoke with her, and whenever I would talk to her, she would always talk about, well, Grandma was Indian, of course, but she never, and I'm part Indian, but she never referred to herself as freedman.
A lot of blacks don't know that they are Indians. And
why don't they know?
Well, they've been told that they're African-American and that they came from Africa, but that they're really been here in the United States as Indians.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And they're really just been given false information from the historical point of view.
A year and a half, a little over almost a year and a half ago, because of all the thousands of people that I've met over my years, conversations with people that look like African American people. And when you really get down to the nit and the grit of it and ask them, what's your ancestry? Oh, my grandma was a Cherokee, or my great-great-grandfather was, I think he was a Seminole. You know what, brother? If you were to walk into any mosque in America and you just laid your hands on the first person or the third person or the fifth person that you see, you realize that you're laying your hands on a Native American?
I believe
there were only 8% of the slaves that came to America. So how is it that there are so many more people that they claim are black or African American? I think they got the numbers wrong, because a lot of Native Americans are the ones that they're counting as black folks too.
100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. Now, have you ever wondered what that passage meant from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech? I did, and what I found was one of the biggest secrets that's not really a secret at all, except to many African Americans, is they are not descended from Africans. I know, I was shocked too, so much so that I asked Africans, and they agreed African Americans weren't Africans. If you don't believe me, Google Arnaldus Montanus America and see the people he saw in 1671. Read books like The Black American Handbook for Survival Through the 21st Century by Radine Amin-Ra, What Every African American Should Know by Carrie Davis, and Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. I just can't believe schools aren't teaching this stuff. What a travesty.